To ensure the peaceful development of nations, free from coercion, the United States has taken a leading part in establishing the United Nations. The United Nations is designed to make possible lasting freedom and independence for all its members. We shall not realize our objectives, however, unless we are willing to help free peoples to maintain their free institutions and their national integrity against aggressive movements that seek to impose upon them totalitarian regimes. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States.
Hello, and welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 9, Through the Looking Glass. Today, we are stepping away from Korea to discuss the global context of the situation on the peninsula. This conversation is split into two separate but deeply connected parts. First, we will talk about the United Nations, and second, we will talk about the beginning of the Cold War. Both have a big effect on what would become the Korean War, and both find a large part of their history changed by the Korean War. That said, the Korean War was not the first challenge to the legitimacy and authority of the United Nations. It was the fourth, and for an organization that, by June 25, 1950, had only been around for less than 5 years, it shows just the amount of stress the UN faced in crafting its identity. The first challenge came before the UN officially took effect. At the Dumbarton Oaks Conference of 1944, representatives of the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and Republic of China met to discuss the big-picture details of a new international diplomatic organization. The Soviet Union actually refused to meet with the Chinese representatives due to the Soviet-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact, which meant that the American and British delegates would negotiate with the Soviet delegates, then take an agreement to the Chinese delegates who were pretty much forced to rubber stamp whatever was brought. The Chinese were only there because Roosevelt wanted them to, at some point in the future, be the, quote, policeman of Asia to fill the void of power left by Japan's fall. One of the points of discussion at this conference concerned the ability of a permanent member of the Security Council, the body within the future organization tasked with handling the greatest threats to international peace, to veto any potential action by the members of the United Nations. The Soviet ambassador to the United States and head of the Soviet delegation to the conference, Andrei Gromyko, believed that the British and American representatives shared his belief that the veto would be absolute, including all matters of action and discussion. Gromyko was half right. The Americans agreed, and the British disagreed with that view of the limits of the veto, only wanting the ability to veto actions and not matters for discussion. But over the course of the conference, a weird thing happened. The men sitting across from Gromyko began to change their minds. By the end of Dumbarton Oaks in October of 1944, the Americans wanted a limited veto, the Brits wanted an unlimited veto, and the Soviets were unmoved from their original position. The discussion moved to the Yalta Conference of early 1945. The Americans presented the Soviets with a compromise. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council could veto anything, so long as it was not a procedural matter, or it was a peaceful dispute that included that power as a party to the dispute. So, for instance, if France, which was now among the great powers again, despite its absolute thrashing during the war, was involved in a dispute with, say, Brazil over some issue with their common border between Brazil and French Guiana, France would abstain from a vote on the dispute if it came before the Security Council. However, the word if in that sentence is carrying a lot of weight. The Security Council was designed so that it would only take up the most severe and pressing matters of international peace and security. Peaceful disputes were not really in the realm of the Council, so it was a small and basically pointless exception. The Soviets agreed to the compromise, the Brits had already been convinced of it before meeting in Yalta, and the 3 allies overcame the first major challenge of building their international diplomatic organization. The United Nations went into effect with the ratification of its charter by all 5 permanent members and the majority of General Assembly members on October 24, 1945. The second challenge came just a few months later. During the war, Allied troops had occupied Iran to secure both a southern route to the Soviet Union and the vast petroleum supplies of Iran. The Soviets, Americans, and British had agreed that, 6 months after war's end, all Allied forces would withdraw from the country. With Japan surrendering in August, the date for withdrawal was set for March 2, 1946. American and British forces withdrew by January of that year, but the Soviets were starting to look a little too settled in, and were suspected of arousing anti-Iranian sentiments in the Azerbaijani-dominated regions in the north of the country. On January 19th, the Iranian ambassador to the UN accused the Soviets of interference in Iran's domestic affairs on the floor of the Security Council. The Soviet ambassador, Andrei Vyshinsky, assured his compatriots that the Soviets would negotiate with the Iranians and proposed the Council endorse such negotiations. The Americans thought it better to just keep the matter on the agenda for now, so they could revisit it down the road, if they needed to. Vyshinsky then complained about the continued occupations of Syria and Indonesia by the British and French, but when confronted with an American proposed resolution approving immediate negotiations for the end of the Anglo-French occupation of Syria, cast the first ever veto against the negotiations. Vyshinsky thought them too weak and wanted the Council to demand a full withdrawal. The matter was tabled. On March 25th, the question of Iran was brought up again. The Soviets announced they were nearly in agreement with the Iranians and planned to leave Iran within 6 weeks. Gromyko then moved to table the matter until April 10th and, after losing that vote, packed his things and left the college gymnasium where the council was meeting. I don't really have a way of fitting this next part in organically, so I'll just say it. Stanley Meisler writes that, as he left, the UN Chief of Security stopped Gromyko and whispered something in his ear. Gromyko then turned slightly and zipped up the fly of his pants. It happens to everyone, folks. After Gromyko's exit, things just kind of fizzled out. The Soviets left Iran as promised, but still after the original date of departure. Its most persistent legacy was of the memorandum the first Secretary General of the UN, Tryggvi, sent in support of the Soviet motion to remove the matter from the Council's agenda after the end of negotiations between the Soviets and Iranians. Lee believed it was not within the best interests of the Security Council to inflame a situation that had apparently been resolved by those involved. This was Lee's first big move to set a precedent for the role of the Secretary General. This could be more important in future series on future events, but for now, just know that it reflects the uncertainty that many felt about what the UN should be. The third challenge came 2 years after that, as the two Koreas prepared for independence and as a new Jewish state attempted to carve itself a home in the desert. I don't want to get into the debate surrounding Palestine and Israel because, frankly, I have not done enough research on the entire situation. What I do want to say is that, after the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust, the Jewish shouts for a home in the Holy Land fell on much more receptive ears. The United Nations, in Stanley Meisler's words, was the midwife at the birth of Israel, and, for a time, it appeared that this was the kind of issue the UN was made for. It did not involve a superpower, and everyone involved had a stake in finding a peaceable outcome for a place that had been a British mandate since the end of the Great War. In November of 1947, the General Assembly approved a report written by the majority of a special committee on Palestine that set the official position of the UN in favor of the partition of Palestine into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and the international city of Jerusalem. When the British announced that they would leave Palestine in May of 1948 and wash their hands of the matter, there was a genuine concern that the Palestinians would, understandably, reject partition. The same day the British left, the Provisional State Council in Tel Aviv declared the Medinath Yisrael, the State of Israel. 11 minutes later, the United States recognized the new country, and the Soviet Union followed suit shortly thereafter. Violence quickly escalated between Jews, Palestinians, and others from their Arab neighbors. Distinguished Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte was appointed to mediate a resolution to the conflict, but was assassinated by Jewish militants in September, before any real progress was made. a most American man, Ralph Bunche, took over the role of lead mediator. Bunche is a fascinating person because, were he a white man, he easily would have been Secretary of State or more. Were he not an American, he would have been Secretary General of the UN. Bunche's life story is one of struggle against the circumstances of his birth, which, I think, made him uniquely qualified to negotiate an end to this first round of the Israeli-Arab conflict. The parties to the conflict met on the Mediterranean island of Rhodes in January of 1949, and, at the first meeting, Bunche opened a drawer to show the gathered delegates a set of commemorative ceramic plates. Pointing at them, he said, "If you reach agreement, each of you will get one to take home. If you don't, I'll break them over your heads." Bunche got the parties to reach agreement in just over a month, with an armistice signed in late February 1949. The question of Palestine, for now, was settled. These three questions, that of the veto, of Iran, and of Palestine, could hardly prepare the United Nations for its greatest challenge yet. By 1950, it was still trying to find its feet in a lot of ways. It had attempted to solve the question of Korea in 1947 and 1948 with the appointment of the Temporary Commission, but that was only half successful once it ran up against Soviet obstinance. The UN had its limits, and those limits were no more starkly defined in its first decade than with the crisis it faced on June 25, 1950. We leave the halls of the General Assembly and Security Council now for a much larger and more important topic, the beginnings of the Cold War. There's lots of different pieces to the Cold War that we could talk about, but I want to specifically discuss the actions of Soviet and American leadership in the years after World War II. The Cold War did not begin immediately after the surrender of Germany and Japan in 1945. There was still a decent amount of optimism among the great powers that cooperation within the Grand Alliance of the war could be maintained to secure global peace going forward. That was the whole point of the United Nations anyway. It took some time for that optimism to fade and then finally collapse by the beginning of the Korean War in 1950. According to Odd Arne Westad, the Cold War was a global phenomenon rare in international political history. Bipolarity was uncommon, as multipolar and unipolar systems were much more likely to happen as empires rise and fall around each other. Specifically, the Cold War was a culmination of the preceding half-century of political, social, and economic development in both the imperial centers and colonial periphery. Westad places the earliest origins of the Cold War in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but says that things really got going with the Great War. The Americans were reluctant to go to war in Europe, but once there, proved to be the final nail in a coffin that was already pretty well buried. After the war, Americans were apparently frightened by what a larger international role would mean, and withdrew back within their borders, leaving the post-war peace to be dictated by their European allies in Paris and London. Meanwhile, Russians were angered at how the Tsarist government managed the war effort and expressed that anger through revolution, leading to the foundation of the first communist state, the Soviet Union. The end of the Second World War marked a turning point, away from a Europe-centric system to a more global system dominated by the still European-influenced duopoly of Washington and Moscow. But even though Europe was on the decline, most people in power still saw it as the great battleground of the conflict between capitalism and communism. By the end of 1945, Americans were no longer unsure of their place in the world. The collapse of the post-Great War system built at Versailles and the great violence wrought upon the world during the Second World War was more than enough to show the United States that its leadership was necessary and unavoidable. There was also a deep belief among the Soviets that their Anglo-American allies were only on their side because of the greater threat posed by Germany. An understandable wartime fear of Stalin's was that the Germans would negotiate peace with the British and Americans so as to more easily fight the Soviet Union. Westad says that the question of why the Grand Alliance could cooperate during the war but fell apart in the Cold War is the wrong question. The Grand Alliance was a marriage of convenience and necessity, and to keep it together after the defeat of the Germans and Japanese would have been a nearly impossible task. While the Cold War was not inevitable, it is highly unlikely things would have gone differently after the end of World War II. While the Cold War's first great conflict broke out in Asia, its biggest ideological battleground was always going to be Europe. the Americans and Soviets carved up the rubble of the old continent in hopes of remaking it in their image. France was shattered in rebuilding its republic, Germany and Austria were divided and occupied, the many countries of Eastern Europe were consolidated into the Moscow-centric Eastern Bloc, and Great Britain was staring down the barrel of the gun of decolonization. In the immediate aftermath of the German collapse of 1945, the Soviets were not going to give up the territory they had won with a great amount of blood. This was agreed to in part by that great friend of the communist, Winston Churchill. At the Fourth Moscow Conference in late 1944, Churchill and Stalin agreed to divide influence in 5 countries in southeastern Europe between themselves. 90% to 10% in Greece, 20% to 80% in Bulgaria and Hungary, 50-50 in Yugoslavia, and 0% to 100% in Romania, for the British and Soviets respectively. This agreement would hold through the Greek Civil War, which broke out due to communist partisan units of the Greek People's Liberation Army, or ELAS, refusing to disband after the German withdrawal from Greece in 1944. The British bombed communist areas of Athens and took back their initial offer of incorporating communist partisans into the Greek state. The Soviets advised the Greek communists to negotiate peace, and the ELAS was dissolved in early 1945. The fighting would continue until 1949, but the Soviets learned an early lesson in Greece. Not all communist parties could successfully lead a revolution on their own. Soviet support and protection were necessary to ensure the revolution was not usurped by traitors. The solution for the Soviets, then, was to create satellites under the name of People's Republics throughout Eastern Europe. The first People's Republic was Outer Mongolia, which had long been under the protection of China but, by 1924, was under the control of the Soviets and could not be a fully integrated Soviet republic in the USSR. Westad puts it best. Quote, People's Republics were halfway houses. They could become fully communist, but not entirely Soviet. End quote. People's Republics were a way for the Soviets to satisfy their desire for a geographic fence to protect their core of European Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus. Even though externally imposed communization was not in line with Marxism-Leninism, it very much was in line with the insecurities of the Soviet Union that were exposed by the German onslaught. These insecurities drove the Soviets to take an increasingly harsher line on non-communists in the territories the Red Army bled for during the war. The Soviets were not alone in Europe, though. Their policies in Eastern Europe were both a cause of and in response to American and British policies in Western Europe, and those policies were forcing cracks into the amicable relationship across the Iron Curtain. Such cracks were well described in George Kennan's long telegram of February 1946. Kennan, then a relatively young diplomat and probably the best expert on Russia in the US government at the time, did not say anything particularly new, but he did do a very good job of putting things in the right order to convince the politicians back in Washington. His message was that the Soviets were expansionist and aggressive, but that war was not necessary if the United States could communicate with the world its plans for a peaceful international system. The Soviets responded with a long telegram of their own, but it feels more like a piece of propaganda than an actual policy document. In hindsight, Kennan's telegram seems larger than I think it was at the time. It was certainly important, don't get me wrong, but if you remove Kennan from the situation, things still move the way they did, just quite a bit slower. Again, very smart guy, very well thought out piece of foreign policy analysis, very much moved things along a bit quicker than they might have otherwise developed, but what Truman said to a joint session of Congress in March of 1947 was going to be said at some point anyway. That's what you heard at the top of the episode. Truman needed congressional approval to send funds to the Greek government to support their continuing fight against communist partisans, and to the Turkish government to modernize and industrialize as a bulwark against communism. The best way to do so was through some good old-fashioned fear-mongering. Congress agreed, the funds were sent, and the Truman Doctrine entered the vernacular of American foreign policy. The Truman Doctrine is just a reflection of the American desire to ascribe presidents with a great foreign policy idea, a la the Monroe Doctrine or the Roosevelt Corollary. At its heart, it was a policy of containment, which would be a key component of the American approach to the Cold War until its very end, and is relatively simple to understand. The spread of Soviet influence and power needed to be limited at every possible opportunity to ensure the security of the United States. Later that year, Secretary of State George Marshall presented to Congress a new plan for European reconstruction. The Marshall Plan would flood any European country that would allow it with American goods and money. All that was required of recipient countries was to cooperate with other recipient countries, allow American envoys to assist in the final apportionment of aid, and allow for external reporting. These seemed like reasonable conditions, so, in 1947, the UK and France invited other European countries to Paris to discuss the European response to the Marshall Plan. The Soviets and their new satellites were, of course, invited. To not do so would show the hand of the Americans prematurely. The Marshall Plan was never really intended to go to Eastern Europe. It would have been nice, but the focus was always going to be on Western Europe and non-Soviet aligned countries. Stalin obliged, sending a delegation to Paris and ordering them to leave after a few days. Foreign Minister Molotov, head of the Soviet delegation, spoke on the plan before leaving. To accept such a thing would be to accept American hegemony over Europe. The Soviets left, and the cracks grew larger. The Marshall Plan was a rousing success, pumping money into the devastated economies of Western Europe. It cannot be understated that in this program we find the kernel of the modern European Union. From the Marshall Plan, a new idea of what Europe meant sprang forth and eventually flourished. The reconstruction of Britain, France, and West Germany provided a bulwark against communism and against a Soviet invasion that held as long as it was needed. The American pocketbook provided further advancements worldwide. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank shored up economic and financial systems. The World Health Organization and Food and Agriculture Organization shored up, health and food systems. And the UN Relief and Recovery Administration led reconstruction efforts across those areas most affected by the war. These institutions formed the foundation for American global dominance both during and after the Cold War. The Soviet response to all of this was to recreate the Communist International with the new Communist Information Bureau, or Cominform. At the foundation of Cominform, its purpose was set thusly by Andrei Zhdanov, Central Party Secretary and close confidant to Stalin. The world was divided into two camps, the imperialists of the United States and the Democrats of the Soviet Union. Everyone needed to pick a side. Real with us or against us stuff, Cominform, comprised entirely of European communist parties, would be at the forefront of spreading the Soviet message across the continent. It grew increasingly irrelevant as the center of communism shifted towards Asia and away from Europe, and it would be dissolved in 1956. Now, I don't want to distract us with a big discussion of German division, mostly because it's something that I think deserves a whole series on the topic. There are some key points I want to cover, however. Germany was divided between the US, the UK, France, and the USSR after the war. The capital, Berlin, was divided similarly, but was smack in the middle of the Soviet zone. The Americans and British effectively combined their zones in late 1946 and, when the Marshall Plan kicked in, began to form a new German state in the western zones. The Soviets, and specifically Stalin, were less sure of what to do with their zone. They split off large chunks to give to Poland, but mostly just kinda let it hang out for the first year of occupation. It was not until the Western Alliance implemented a new currency in their zones, threatening the Soviet zone with massive inflation due to an influx of otherwise worthless money, that the Soviets really had to pick a direction in Eastern Germany. Westad writes that, quote, "The reasons why Stalin wanted a united Germany were exactly the same reasons why the United States, by 1947, did not," end quote. The US wanted to incorporate German industries into the new US-centric Europe. The Soviets, whose zone was much more agricultural and much less industrial than the Western zones, wanted the political party they supported to spread its influence across all of Germany and bring the linchpin of Europe closer to Moscow. When currency reform was implemented, unification grew ever more unlikely, and Western Berlin became more isolated. The Berlin Blockade, implemented by the Soviets from June of 1948 to May of 1949, was a failure for three reasons. 1. The Americans and British overcame the effects of the blockade through a massive relief effort, proving to Berliners that they would be taken care of through the crisis. 2. The Soviets proved to skeptical Germans that they and their great city was just another pawn in the Soviets' game of great power chess. 3. It pushed the Truman administration towards a formal military alliance with the still rebuilding Europe. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed to guarantee the security of Western Europe against Soviet invasion. NATO's mutual defense provision was key to its longevity and to its ability to draw in new members. Western European leaders, no matter their politics, were more afraid of the Soviets than they were of the Americans in 1949, and were more than happy to let a few Americans set up camp in their countries if it meant protection from the Soviets. All of this contributed to a culture of fear in both the Soviet Union and the United States that would contribute directly to the internationalization of the Korean War. In August 1949, the Cold War truly went atomic. The Soviets tested their first atom bomb, and although their potential for production was much lower than the Americans, they had proven to themselves and the world that they could build an A-bomb, and that mattered more than anything. The United States no longer held a monopoly on the explosive potential of the atom. A nuclear specter would hang over every conflict involving a superpower from here on out, none more so than Korea. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with two imperial powers unsure of the implications of such power, but more than willing to wield their new influence. This episode was just a primer on the Cold War and the United Nations. If you'd like to learn much more about the origins of the Cold War, I recommend Zach Twomley's series When Diplomacy Fails. Zach takes much more time than I am able to, really going deep into the specific circumstances that caused the Cold War. Next week, we are talking about just one very big thing, the Chinese Civil War. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're already following us there, I would very much appreciate any feedback on what you'd like to see out of those channels. We've done some on this day type content because I want to bring your attention to certain events that I find interesting or are connected to this series in some way. If you'd like to see something else, please let me know through the contact form on our website. If you're not on social media, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.